When you think of a stereotypical French person, you think of one with a beret, a glass of wine in one hand, and a cigarette in the other. But does France really deserve its chain-smoking reputation?
Tourists often say it's one of the first culture shocks that they experience in France. But if you look at the stats, the number of people smoking is actually dropping quite dramatically.
So what has the French government done to get people to stop smoking? And if more and more people are quitting, why is the cliché so hard to stamp out?
Join us as we light into France's smoking culture.
Part of the reason you might associate smoking with France is because the English word cigarette comes from the French cigarette,
which is a diminutive of the word cigare, which comes from the Spanish word cigarro. And that's because cigarettes first became popular in France in the 1830s when Napoleonic soldiers brought them back from Spain.
Up until then, the main form of tobacco consumption was sniffing tobacco. But what's the smoking situation like today?
Well, experts say that smoking has increased slightly due to the stress of the coronavirus pandemic. So let's look at the figures from right before. In 2019, 30% of adults above the age of 18 said they smoke. That's over 10 million people. If you break it down by gender, 35% of men are smokers and about a quarter of all women.
French public health officials have been trying to crack down on smoking for years because the consequences, of course, can be terrible. In France, smoking is the #1 cause of avoidable death.
Well, it's estimated that some 75,000 people die prematurely each year due to smoking-related diseases. That is 200 people a day and 20 times more than road accidents.
And yet, in France, tobacco and tobacco shops are everywhere.
They're big, they're red, and they're a familiar sight in France. We're talking about the luminous Taba signs that indicate a licensed seller of tobacco products, called a buraliste in French.
The ubiquitous Taba signs have a surprising name. They're called une carotte, like a carrot.
That's because back in the 16th century, tobacco was sold in little rolls tied up with string that looked like a carrot. And on top of that, to consume the tobacco, you had to grate it. If the tabac signs are hard to miss, so are the cigarette butts, especially in big cities like Paris, where authorities are waging a war against discarded cigarette butts.
Each day, some 10 million cigarette butts are collected in the capital. That's about 350 tons of waste a year.
To crack down on the pollution, authorities have increased fines. These days, if you're caught chucking a cigarette butt, it will cost you 135 euros. Though more and more ashtrays are available around the city, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Part of the reason why smoking is still so common here in France is because the way people look at it is just quite different.
If you light up on the street, for example, you probably won't get a dirty look. Smoking in France is still associated with the arts, culture, festive debauchery, rather than a tacky lack of self-control.
Well, smoking is seen as kind of a rebellious, almost romantic gesture, a rejection of a Puritan society that's constantly promoting self-betterment.
Recently, though, the government has started to wonder if maybe the secret to changing smoking culture just might be culture itself.
Well, smoking is arguably romanticized by French culture, and in particular on the silver screen.
It's a prop that pops up in almost every French movie, la cigarette. French films are full of stars puffing away, be it Jean-Paul Belmondo, Brigitte Bardot, Catherine Deneuve, or Alain Delon. And it's not just the classics. According to a recent study, 7 in 10 new French films feature people smoking. Unlike Hollywood blockbusters, smoking is not a trademark of bad guys. Back in 2017, then Health Minister Agnès Buzyn hit a raw nerve when she seemed to suggest that French filmmakers should stop featuring smokers in their movies. This prompted an existential question. What would French cinema be without the cigarette? While studies suggest smoking in movies makes people want to light up, others say banning cigarettes in movies is a slippery slope and a first step towards Puritan moralistic cinema. Would you ban people drinking alcohol or speeding? free cigarette advertising versus censorship. Smoking on the silver screen continues to ignite passionate debates.
Despite France's chain smoking reputation, the number of smokers has actually dropped dramatically since the 1950s, particularly over the past few years.
Well, for instance, between 2016 and 2017, the number of people smoking on a daily basis dropped by 1 million, which is a lot for a population of 67 million.
Before that, though, it just seemed like all of the government's anti-tobacco policies just weren't working.
France's anti-smoking laws were pioneered by Simone Veil when she was health minister. Her 1976 Veil law banned all advertisements for tobacco on TV and on the radio, and this was reinforced by the 1991 Loi Evin, which banned all advertising as well as smoking in collective areas like schools and on public transportation.
Then in 2007, smoking was banned in indoor spaces, things like offices, restaurants, bars, but that didn't really work either. It just seemed to push more people outside to keep on smoking.
So what worked this time? Well, it seems to be a combination of factors, including a change of packaging.
Since 2017, all cigarette packs are neutral. There are no logos. What you will find, however, are some pretty gruesome pictures, things like black lungs, or else big warnings on the packs that say smoking kills or causes infertility.
And parallel to this, there has been a steady increase in the price of cigarettes. For instance, a pack will cost you about 10 euros these days, whereas a decade ago it was less than 4 euros.
The government is also trying to help people quit by partially reimbursing tobacco substitutes, things like nicotine patches or nicotine gum.
But the real trick is to try and stop people from starting in the first place. To dig a little deeper into France's smoking culture, I'm joined by Maria Melchior. Thank you so much for being with us today. You're a research director at the Pierre-Louis Institute for Epidemiology and Public Health. You're specialized in addiction. Why is it that smoking is still so associated with France if the numbers of smokers are dropping?
Yes, the number of smokers has been dropping over time, and that's a great public health success. But as you can probably see, smokers are very visible in the public space, in restaurants, in bars, in movies. We're in a medical school here, and right now the students are not here every day, but when they are, they go out to smoke right in front of the door, so right in front of the entrance. So when you walk into the building, you have to make your way through a huge crowd of smokers downstairs. And yeah, it's still not taboo at all to smoke in front of universities, even in front of medical schools, in front of high schools. There's a lot of tolerance of smoking.
So key demographic is young people. The average age that people start experimenting with tobacco is when they're a teenager, 13, 14. Why is it that it's so hard to change that attitude to smoking in young people?
Well, adolescence is a period when young people try to break different types of rules and experiment with many different things, and smoking is part of that. Cigarettes are easily accessible. You can go to any tobacco shop and buy cigarettes even when you're under 18. That's actually
even though there's a fine. If you're caught selling cigarettes, you get a 135 euro fine, but it doesn't really work.
It doesn't really work. And as long as there's a sufficient number of people smoking, it still remains normal in some ways.
Another demographic difference is the number of women who smoke in France. It's quite steady. Why is it that women smoke so much in France?
That's a good question. Well, some studies show that women use smoking to control their weight, for instance, and they're much more afraid of reducing smoking because they're afraid that they'll gain weight if they do so. They also tend to smoke less, and we know that smokers who have limited levels of smoking have more difficulty quitting or reducing their smoking because they don't think that it's really dangerous for their health.
In terms of the profile of smokers in France, have you noticed any differences in terms of socioeconomic background or even geographic origin?
Yeah, of course, there are very big socioeconomic differences. So maybe what's peculiar about France compared to other countries is that there's actually still a relatively high proportion of people who have graduated from university work in qualified jobs and so on who smoke, it's approximately 17%. But among people who haven't gone to university or who are unemployed, the levels are double. And in terms of geography, there are very big differences as well. Some of the most disadvantaged areas are the places where people smoke most. So the north of France, for instance, the south. These regions also happen to be near borders. And so it's quite easy for people to buy cigarettes abroad where they're cheaper.
The government has taken a lot of measures to try and tackle smoking in France. Do you see any others that could be taken to try and reduce the numbers even more?
The issue is still that cigarettes do remain quite accessible. So, for instance, one thing that could be done is to really implement verifications of IDs when young people go to tobacco shops and buy cigarettes. And the other thing is that smoking is still very visible, and as long as it is very visible in movies, in restaurants, in parks, everywhere, it becomes normal. I mean, it stays normal. So if we could reduce the visibility of smoking in the public space, it would probably be the next step to actually prevent young people, especially from starting to smoke.
Maria, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you.
Many of you sent in your questions and comments about smoking in France, like RG, who wanted to know why during the strictest lockdown in France, tobacco was still considered an essential good, with tobacco stores still open.
Well, it certainly did raise a lot of eyebrows, especially as there were studies suggesting that smokers were more at risk of contracting a severe form of COVID-19. But specialists say that as tobacco is very addictive, there was also the risk that smokers would break the quarantine to get a nicotine fix. So it was better to leave those tobacco shops open.
Despite the progress that's been made, there's still a long way to go till France changes its somewhat laissez-faire attitude towards smoking, and perhaps even longer till France's smoking reputation gets changed as well.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's show, but thank you so much for watching, and you can keep tweeting me your questions at Villeminot or reach out on social media.
And we'll see you soon for another French Connections Plus.